What do you think of when you think of the word oppression? Right, especially in today's world, right, when we talk about all this identity politics and intersectionality things, people don't really have an idea of what oppression means. I think, though, that we can imagine being put in chains, being in slavery. Right, that's a form of oppression. In the first century, when people thought about oppression, the thing that personified oppression was the Roman occupation. That is, I'm speaking of Jews in the first century. That the absence of political sovereignty in Israel, this is what was oppression. And this is what they thought the Messiah would come and do. The Messiah came to bring them out from under that oppression. But there's a sense in which, those things are oppression, but I feel like we today don't even fully understand what the oppression was like in the ancient world, because we live in a different world. And the things that oppressed people more than anything is not Rome, right? It's the satanic influence in the world. Do you ever think about the fact that when you're reading in the Bible, and you're reading the Gospels, you hear all these interactions between Jesus and demons? Here, Jesus enters a synagogue, and in the synagogue itself, right, in Israel, you have people oppressed by demons, people possessed by demons. Have you seen that recently? Right? I know that there's a lot of people, especially in some of the charismatic movements, that want to see demons right everywhere. Or if your car's not starting right, it's like, cast out the demon. But there must be a demon behind this. But the fact is, we do not live in the same world as the ancient world. And we're so far removed from it that I don't think that we fully understand. So I want to just kind of talk about a little bit about that this morning, focusing in this text on Jesus' interaction with the demons. Because you also may notice that when you're reading through the New Testament, Paul and other writers constantly make this reference about Jesus being superior to the angels. And when we hear that today, we think, well, obviously. But why is that something that they repeat over and over again? Because that was a revolutionary claim in the ancient world, that Jesus has been exalted above the angels, that the angels are now under him, that he's above every principality and powers, orders of the angelic host. Well, I want to give some background and talk about the world as it was created and in the fall, and how Jesus came and changed the whole power structure of the world. And this is why today you don't have people out right and left being possessed by demons and things. When God made the world, we're told that he made man for a short while lower than the angels in Psalm 8. Man was created. Even though God set man over the work of all his hands, but he was under, for a short while, guardians, stewards. And we're told that this is the way even the Bible speaks about the Old Covenant itself, in Galatians. And that, think about it like this. He said, Paul says this in Galatians: so long as the child, even though you have a child that's going to be the heir of the whole house, maybe he's a prince, but while he's a minor, he's under these guardians. And Paul says, and he's no better off than a slave, even though he's the one that has all the authority. And that's what man was like at creation. God had destined man to take over the entire created order, but for a short while, he set these ministers, he calls angels ministers, over him. And what happened in the fall, this is what this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was all about. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Bible is a tree of ruling, right? The knowledge of good and evil is what Solomon asks for God when he goes to be king. And God says, ask of me anything. He says, give me the knowledge of good and evil, that I may rule these people. And ultimately, so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not a bad tree. Right? God put it in the middle of the garden, and he said, behold, it is all very good. And so God did not make a bad tree in the middle of the garden and then call it very good. It was a good tree. But it was prohibited from Adam because he had not yet come into that position. He was still the minor. Right? So if anything, it would be that he could eventually, God would say, now you can come to this tree. But what Adam did is he reached out prematurely and tried to seize that which God had not given him. And in doing so, he fell and plunged the creation into a state of sin and death, but in that power structure that you had in the garden, where angels were over man. And it's very possible that that the fall of Adam is also the fall of Satan. Right? That the angels see that this person is going to supplant me. Now's our chance. And so that the angelic hosts that fall, that the power structure of the created order is the angels, the angelic host, were over man. And that's the way the ancient world worked. And this is why there's all sorts of involvement in the ancient world between demons and the world. And here, or even in Corinthians, Paul talks about how when people offer meat to idols, they're really offering them to demons. Right? The demonic host had an interaction with the world in a visible form. What Jesus came to do was to overthrow that. And this is why I said it's hard for us to even imagine what this was like, because we're so far separated. We do not live in the same world. Right? Jesus came as the new Adam, right? The last Adam, a new man, and he came to take back, the world. And Jesus comes. It's important, that when Jesus, the other week I said that you could define the gospel as how, the Son of God became king. And I said it was because when Jesus became, in one sense, as God in his deity, yes, always king. But the gospel is how God became a man, and that man became king, over all of creation. That's what Jesus comes to do. It goes all the way back to the garden, the way that God had destined for man, to ultimately be over and rule over the whole world. But it gets locked in that estate of man in his immaturity, never coming into that position of rule and authority. And so when Jesus comes, he comes and we see him constantly at war with the demonic host. And Jesus is superior to them. Jesus commands them and they obey him. Jesus is overturning the power structures in the world. And that just didn't happen before Jesus. And everyone is astonished by it. And when Jesus does it, it's coming with his teaching. Jesus is announcing, remember the text right before this is the text where Jesus is announcing the good news, the gospel. And he says in the gospel is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All of these promises of the kingdom being restored are now coming to pass. And this is the message that he's preaching. And the people are astonished at what he's teaching. And then Jesus is demonstrating that right, by casting out demons and right, battling sickness and death and disease, right? All these things that are the true oppressive force, right, in the world. And Jesus is right, not just proclaiming that the kingdom is coming, he is showing it. And he's showing it. Again, the thing that startles people is that when they see even the demons, right, even the unclean spirits obey him. And Christians, this is the one of the important things of the gospel that we just don't get today. Right? People don't talk about this because, again, no one lives in that world because that world no longer exists. Right? Jesus came to change the world. What you have is you finally, in one sense, have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil opened up to man in Jesus Christ. This is the important thing about the resurrection and the ascension. Oftentimes, people, and don't get me wrong when I say this, I'm not trying to say somehow lower the cross, but when we talk about the gospel, if the only thing that we talk about is the death of Christ, then it's a truncated gospel. It's only part of it. It's a piece of what Christ came to do. It had to happen. But then we almost talk about the resurrection or the ascension as if they don't really matter. Growing up, I remember thinking and hearing people talk about the resurrection as if it was just, not necessarily an essential part of the faith. It didn't really add anything to the faith. It was a great miracle that just proclaimed the power of God, a great proof of God's existence. But remember, there's multiple people that were raised from the dead. A couple days before Jesus rose from the dead, there were a whole lot of people around Jerusalem that were raised from the dead. Jesus was not raised back to the same life he had before. Right? You might call something like those resurrections were like a resuscitation. Someone was dead and they weren't just like flatlined on the operating table. I mean, these people were dead and buried. And right, like Lazarus, come forth. But it's the same old Lazarus. What Jesus did is brought into existence a new humanity. He was raised in glory. And he was raised, right, not as man in his immature state in the power structure of the world. Jesus was raised as the king. And this is also why the ascension is a crucial part of the faith. When we talk about Jesus, we confess in the Nicene Creed that Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. And he's going to come again to judge the living and the dead. The ascension is Jesus taking the reins of the universe. When Satan tried to tempt Jesus, and he shows him all the kingdoms of the earth, and he says, all of these I'll give to you. I'll put you over all of them. Fall down and worship me. Satan wasn't making, in one sense, an empty boast. I mean, he was obviously lying. He was trying to trick Jesus he was trying to tempt Jesus. But it wasn't like Satan was making a claim to something that he didn't have. That's the way the world worked. He was the prince of the power of the air. Satan is saying, all of these are mine. I'm in charge of them all. But you can be. You can be right underneath me. You can be second in command. Fall down and worship me. Jesus came to take that kingdom. Jesus came, when Jesus, at one point, Jesus healed someone, and the Pharisees, and the scribes and the Pharisees says, he heals them by the power of Beelzebub. Jesus says, does Satan cast out Satan? And Jesus tells them what we call the parable of the strong man. And he's like, you don't go into if you have this strong man, you don't go and plunder his house until you bind him. Until you go in and you bind the strong man, then you plunder his house. And what's Jesus doing? He's plundering the house of Satan. And what Jesus is saying is, I've already bound him. In one sense, the victory is already won. Now I'm going to go ransack his house. This is why, or one of the reasons why Jesus came. He came, right, to change the world. He came to ransack, right, the house of Satan and the demonic powers that ruled over the world. And in the resurrection and in the ascension, what you have is a man, Jesus Christ, right, the God-man, but in his humanity, ascending up into heaven to take the throne, right, at the helm of the universe. And that is what we are proclaiming in the gospel, right? And this is why Paul can summarize the gospel by saying, Jesus Christ is Lord. He's King. And this is why it's emphasized over and over again that Jesus Christ is above the angels, that the angels are now beneath him. And then Paul even says this, he says to the church, he says, don't you know that we shall judge the angels? Talk about overturning the power structures of the world. And Christians, this is something that we need to be aware of, because if you were in the first century, you would have lived in a different world. But you've been removed from 2,000 years from what Christ has done to change the world. And it's changed the entire world. And people walk around and they don't even know it. They don't even realize what Jesus has done in changing the power structures of the world. But Christians, this is what Christ has done. He's delivered us, right, into a new creation. And he's come to truly fight against that which bound humanity. He's delivered us from the demonic powers. He comes to fight against sickness and ultimately death. In Christians, he came to bring, as I said last week, to bring into existence a new creation. Right? And that is the great hope of our lives. Right? Jesus is already in charge, and Jesus, this is why before he ascends, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth is now mine. And this is what we're called to do. This is the basis of the Great Commission. He says, go therefore. Right? On the basis of that, on the basis of the fact that I'm now king, and all authority in heaven and on earth is mine, let me give you a mission. Right? Go into all the world and make all the nation my disciples. Right? In Christians, when we look out into the world today, you know, sometimes when I tell people, oh, I'm a post-millennialist, I think that the world's good. When Jesus returns, he's going to return to a Christianized world. People are like, you're crazy. Have you ever read the newspaper? And I'm like, well, I don't believe what I believe because of what the newspaper says. I believe what I believe because of what God says. And the victory belongs to Jesus. And I don't care what the world looks like out there, right? Well, I mean, I care about it, but I don't care about it as far as determining what I believe is going to take place. Right? When the world did the worst it could do, or in Psalm 2 tells us, when the nations gathered to conspire against God and say, let us cast their cords off from us, and they crucified the Lord of glory, Psalm says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Right, this world, Isaiah calls the power of the world, he says they're like dust on the scales. They don't even register. They can't even tip the scales. But God has set Christ upon the throne. He's given him the name that is above every name. And we're told so that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that he is the Lord, right? That he is King. In Christians, how can Jesus lose? How could he possibly lose in history? He's the King. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. How can the church possibly lose in the Great Commission? How can the church possibly fail? Because when Jesus gives the Great Commission, he says, all this authority is mine. You just need to go see it realized. I've already won the decisive victory. Right? You guys are just going there, right, to see it realized. And then Jesus says, and don't be worried, I will be with you until the end of the age. I am with you always. Who's with us? The one who's seated at the right hand of God, the one who has all authority in heaven and on earth. Christians, Jesus has changed the world. Jesus Christ was the man that dethroned the angelic powers and is now seated at the right hand of the Father. And from there he shall come to judge the living and the dead. He is the Lord, the King, Jesus Christ.